It's not easy when James becomes the epistle readings, is it? Our Lutheran lights kind of go off on warnings, and I think that's because there are a lot of bad theology and bad theologians around the book of James. James is an interesting epistle. Luther didn't hate it nearly as much as people think he hates it because, of course, it ended up in the Bible. But the thing to remember about James is it is descriptive, not prescriptive. You are not saved by your works. What happens is you have a heart that is changed and you bear good fruit. This is what Galatians is talking about, bearing good fruit. Now, no one would say that, or I hope none of us would say, well, if you want to make sure you're saved, check your do what they say, do a fruit check. Check to see if you're bearing good fruits. No. James here is talking about how the fact that when we work, when we perform actions, it's the same thing as when we make confessions. And our actions are a form of confessions. Our actions display what we are proclaiming, the fact that Christ has come to give us life and life abundantly. And of course, that's what our gospel lesson is really all about. I think the gospel lesson confuses a lot of people here, and it is very confusing if we kind of look at it by itself. I think one of the main things that strikes us about this gospel lesson is just how unexpected it all is. Sometimes we just don't get what we expect. For instance, many of us have read a book. We thought, I've got one book that I read and I thought, oh, it's going to be this, and it turned out to be something completely different. And yet it's a book I still recommend to people who wanted to know about this particular subject. I thought it was going to be more sociological, but it was history. And it turned out to be a wonderful, edifying book. Some of us have also attended classes, and maybe those classes were back in high school, maybe they were in college, and we went in thinking it was going to be one thing, and it turned out to be another. I remember that's how I actually got one of my degrees. I went to a class thinking it was going to be this one thing, and pretty soon I ended up going into a completely different field in undergrad. Or maybe, you accidentally ordered some food, some dish at a restaurant, and it arrives, and you're really kicking yourself, and you're wondering about it, and then you start eating, and you find out that you love it, and soon it works itself onto your rotating menu of things. It doesn't happen often, and you can't plan for something unexpected. That's the reason why it's unexpected. And yet, it's sometimes these unexpected things just completely change you. Now, for many of us in America, this is a tall hurdle to get over. Anyone who has turned on the nightly news realizes that Americans really prioritize believing getting what we want. There are always stories about people who become belligerent when they don't get what they want. And we kind of look at them and say, why would you go off the handle? Sometimes getting what you didn't expect turns out to be a wonderful thing. But our gospel lesson also corrects us in this too. Our recent gospel lessons have been about the unexpected joy of this unpredictable God whom we worship and glorify. Now, we've watched as the Messiah has walked into the lives of people just muddling through, challenged expectations of dead religion, pushed back against sin and evil, and given humanity a vision for what real life looks like. And yet, even though we have this gospel, we crack it open, we read these life-giving stories. We hear about the author of life stepping into the story that he has constructed. Even then, people who say, we have had an encounter with God, whether through the Bible or through the Holy Spirit, even we too can fall back into the temptation of sameness. Like someone looking over the edge of the world into this new world, and then turning around and going back to the world we came from. I think that is probably what is happening to so many churches. I think that's why so many churches find themselves in a terrible, terrible struggle. It's the fact that, not that we're not law-abiding enough. That's not the issue. No, what is the problem with so many churches is that we forget what the gospel looks like when it bears itself out. Whether that is the fruits talked about by Paul in Galatians, or whether that happens to be the good deeds or the life-changing deeds, is probably a better phrase, that James speaks of. Many of us, and poll after poll shows this, many people couldn't pick a Christian out of a lineup. I know I'm that way sometimes too. It's so easy to drift back into sameness, to put that book back on the shelf. Put aside that class that meant so much to us. Forgo that special dish. And Jesus' journey shows that God's unexpected movement brings with it healing and wholeness into its wake. Now, our passage goes through three movements here. Jesus moves out of Israel into Tyre and Sidon, and from there down to the Decapolis. He moves out of Israel into Tyre and Sidon, and back down to the Decapolis. All three of these movements show how God's holiness has moved out of heaven, stepped down from heaven, and come into the world. And it's this series of escalation. And notice here that the works of Christ are going to be tied up explicitly with his proclamation. I think that's something we miss here. And too often that's what we miss in the miracles. We think they're magic tricks, parlor tricks, and if we were just there and could watch him do it again, maybe we could figure out how he did it. That's not the case. The fact is that someone from the outside, someone outside the world, has come in and changed the world in which we live. Now, as we read the various gospel readings separately over the past few weeks, it's easy for us to miss the Gospels are intentionally connecting a larger story together throughout the writing, and that's what's happened. I know personally I have trouble remembering what came last week, and I am constantly, when I'm working on the sermons, going back and rereading what's come before. But this is, I sound like a conspiracy theorist. It's all connected. It's all connected. The story is all connected together. And here we see that the gospel readings separately, taken separately, cause us to miss this vital point, these vital points. The first part of Mark is intentionally laying down the foundation of Christ's authority by setting forth his teaching and works of power. Now, the second part concerns itself with the pushback that the world will give Christ for proclaiming the reign of God. And of course, all of this is connected to bread. Remember back in chapter 2 of Mark, the Pharisees had criticized him for breaking bread with sinners. And then later on, they criticized him in front of the disciples because the disciples are picking grain heads on the Sabbath. Now, there's a lot of theology there, but I know that we have a church meeting at the end of worship, so I'll probably just keep on moving. In chapter 6, he has fed the multitude, and in the next chapter will do so again. And not only has he fed them, but there is bread to spare. And last week, he stood up to the Pharisees for picking on the disciples for the fact that they were not ritually cleansed as they were breaking bread together in table fellowship. It's easy to overlook this. Well, now Jesus leaves the Jewish area, the area of people who are ritually clean and who find themselves unclean. They can make themselves unclean by not following the ritual purity laws. And yet, he goes into the Gentile region. When he goes into the Gentile region, what happens there? They're all ritually unclean. There's nothing they can do to clean themselves. They wouldn't know how. He's moving from a group of people who have made themselves unclean to a group of people who are unclean by nature. And it's here that we see the second movement in Tyre and Sidon. This woman comes up to him, thinking him to be like any other potentate or religious lawkeeper. And so she knows how to handle these kinds of people. The first thing she does is she goes through the motions and bows before him. It says this. She bows before him, prostrates herself before him. But then her words are accusatory of him. These are not words asking for something. These are words that are demanding something. And so she's dealt with powerful people before. And she thinks this is just another powerful ruler or another powerful religious leader. All she has to do is go and go through the motions, but also be accusatory, as if he does not wish to give her everything. And so he meets her expectations with seeming contempt. But this is because she is thinking that Jesus' works of power are strictly human. And that to get what she wants, she both offers the form of fealty along with scolding. Christ disarms her. I don't know about you. Have you ever been disarmed by Christ? Have you ever come up to him and said, you should do this or you should do that, only to be confronted with it? Or better yet, the gospel. Anyone who's looked into the gospel realizes the scary thing about the gospel is there's nothing we can do to earn our salvation. That's scary for humans who are used to working to earn everything. But the gospel is freely given. And it means that God demands not our bits and pieces on the side. He demands all of us. Christ disarms her with a statement. He is saying there are insiders and there are outsiders. The people of Israel are the insiders. The salvation is going to come from there. And her response then is that the crumbs that come from the table, should also fall on people who may not have gotten them out. Now, in the previous section of Mark, remember what it says: Jesus in this way declared all foods to be clean. Now, the ritual purity that happens comes as a free gift from Christ and doesn't come from our works, doesn't come from our making sure all of our T's are crossed and I's dotted. And the same thing is true here then. This is an expansion of that theory, because it's not only that all foods and being an obedient Jew will get you saved. It's now that all people are considered saved if they just have faith in the Messiah. And what's interesting is she's asking for crumbs. So once again, we have that bread motif again. She's asking for the crumbs on the table. This should make us think of the feeding of the multitude from just a few chapters earlier, and the next feeding of the multitude, which is just going to come back. What do we know about the crumbs from those tables? They had to get baskets in order to gather them all up. And so this is a wonderful illustration. A wonderful illustration of how our vision of God is too small. We think that God is going to just give us the crumbs from the table. Instead, it's blessing upon blessing. In Revelation chapter 19, verses 6 through 9, we're told about the banquet feast of the Lamb at the end of all things. And here this woman is getting a foretaste of the banquet feast of the Lamb. Jesus now leaves the Gentile coast and goes to the Greek towns. Different groups of Gentiles here. Here in the Decapolis, he meets a group of people who bring a friend to be healed. Now, the Decapolis had been settled by many Gentile groups, but mostly Greek speakers. And they had come there, and while it may not have been a dominant Gentile or Greek area, it still had a large portion. So whether or not these people were Jewish who came before Christ, or they were Gentiles who came before Christ, it doesn't matter. Both of them would have been in contact with ritual impurity. These people reside in a land with those who are ritually unclean. And so then Jesus takes the person who is brought before him, the person in need, and he takes this person aside and gives him hearing. He then uses physical means, touch and saliva. And before any of you get grossed out, saliva at this time was considered a healing thing. Galen, the most famous of doctors at the time, actually even recommended it. But instead, looking at the world for other people, Christ looks to heaven. He's done this once before, and again, this brings us back to the feeding of the multitude, because it's the feeding of the multitude where Christ looks up to heaven before he breaks bread. And now he's looking up to heaven as he's giving this person. He is the bread of heaven. We come to that final part where it says, and though the crowd is told to be silent about his works, we're told that they proclaim the miracle of hearing and speech all the more zealously. You know, we're not that different from the people in the gospel. And that's the beauty of the gospel. The woman who thinks she needs to grovel and cajole to get her heart's desire. The deaf mute who's only alone for the ride as friends try to get him the help that he needs. The crowd, too busy speaking of the glories of Christ to actually listen to his commands or find out what his priorities may be. Most of all, we think we know the Christian religion, and we know it so well that we are literally blindsided when the gospel enters into our lives. Whether we are in Judea or the Phoenician coast or 10 cities, we find we cannot escape the radical change that comes into our lives when he comes into town. And as much as we would like to think otherwise, we are so very like our neighbors. We think that the goals of our life is to be happy or comfortable or unchallenged in how we think life works. Yet when we proclaim the gospel, we find that it is not just our neighbors who experience change, but us too. The proclamation of the gospel actually proclaims in our heart as we're proclaiming to other people's hearts. The only thing required is for us to listen and to be fed. Amen.